Listen closely, because what I'm about to tell you is something most men completely misunderstand, and it quietly changes everything about how she feels about you in the most intimate way possible. Not through effort that looks loud on the outside, but through small, consistent signals that speak directly to her emotions, her comfort, and her sense of safety with you when the world goes quiet at night. There is a moment in almost every close relationship when words start to matter less, and presence starts to matter more. It is not about what you say in big declarations, but what you communicate in silence, in routine, in the way you show up when there is nothing to prove. This is where nighttime becomes powerful. Because at night, the mind slows down, defenses drop, and emotional awareness becomes sharper. What you do in those hours, especially the rituals you create around your own care and presence, starts to shape how she perceives your strength, your stability, and your ability to be deeply connected without pressure or confusion. One of the most overlooked elements in this space is something simple, almost too simple for most people to take seriously, yet deeply symbolic in how it affects attraction and intimacy over time. A nighttime oil routine, not as a magic trick or an instant transformation, but as a consistent practice of self-care, presence, and grounding that influences how you carry yourself, how you feel in your own body, and how naturally that calm confidence transfers into your interactions with her. When a man starts taking care of himself in a quiet, intentional way before sleep, something shifts in his energy. He becomes less reactive, more centered, and far more emotionally available without trying to force it. And this is where things begin to connect on a deeper level. Attraction in long-term intimacy is not built on intensity alone. It is built on familiarity that still feels alive. It is built on emotional safety mixed with quiet desire. When she senses that you are grounded in your own body, not rushing through life, not constantly distracted, not neglecting yourself, she begins to relax around you in a different way. She starts to trust not just your words, but your presence. And presence, more than anything else, is what deepens intimacy over time. A nighttime oil routine becomes a signal, not just to yourself, but indirectly to the emotional atmosphere you carry into the relationship. When a man takes a few minutes at the end of the day to slow down, to care for his skin, to use something as simple as oil on his face, his beard, or even his hands and body, he is doing more than maintenance. He is telling his nervous system that the day is ending, that he is safe, that he is not in survival mode anymore. And when a man is no longer in survival mode, he becomes far more capable of emotional connection, patience, and subtle attentiveness, all of which are deeply felt by a partner. Many relationships struggle not because of a lack of attraction, but because of a lack of emotional rhythm. One partner is always rushed, always thinking ahead, always slightly disconnected from the present moment. Over time, that creates distance, even if love is still there. But when a man introduces grounding rituals into his night, especially something tactile and calming like an oil routine, he begins to rewire that rhythm. He slows himself down in a way that allows emotional closeness to naturally grow instead of being forced during conversations or planned moments. There is also a physical dimension to this that cannot be ignored. When you take care of your skin, your touch becomes more intentional. You become more aware of sensation, more aware of softness, warmth, and contact. This might sound subtle, but in intimacy, subtlety is everything. The way you touch your own skin reflects the way you begin to understand touch itself. And when that awareness carries into your relationship, even simple gestures like holding hands, a light touch on her shoulder, or being physically close on a quiet night carry more meaning than before. What most men do not realize is that attraction is constantly shaped in the in-between moments. Not during dates, not during big events, but during the ordinary nights when nothing dramatic is happening. She notices whether you are present or distracted. She feels whether you are taking care of yourself or neglecting yourself. She picks up on whether you are grounded or restless. And all of this forms a silent emotional impression that influences how she opens up to you over time. A nighttime oil routine becomes part of that silent language. It is not about impressing her directly. It is about becoming the kind of man who does not abandon himself at the end of the day. A man who still invests in his own well-being even when no one is watching. That kind of consistency builds an internal strength that is felt externally. And when she is close to you, she does not just see it, she senses it. There is also something deeply calming about ritual itself. The human mind responds strongly to repetition that signals safety. When you repeat a simple routine before sleep, your brain starts associating it with relaxation and emotional closure. This reduces internal stress, improves mood stability, and creates a smoother transition into rest. And when a man sleeps better, thinks clearer, and feels more balanced, it naturally affects how he shows up in intimacy. Not in a performative way, but in a way that feels more stable, more confident, and less pressured. Women often respond more strongly to emotional steadiness than intensity. Intensity can be exciting, but steadiness is what builds trust, and trust is what allows deeper intimacy to develop without hesitation. When your lifestyle reflects calm discipline, even in something as simple as skincare or oil application at night, it becomes part of a larger pattern she unconsciously reads as reliability. Not just in romance, but in emotional presence. Over time, this creates a shift in dynamic. You stop chasing connection and start embodying it. You stop trying to force attraction and instead become a space where attraction can naturally exist. Because she does not feel pressure around you, she feels openness. And in that openness, emotional closeness and physical desire both become more natural, more fluid, and more real. This is where the deeper understanding begins to form. Intimacy is not built in grand gestures. It is built in nervous system regulation, emotional availability, and quiet consistency. A nighttime oil routine may seem small on the surface, but it represents something much larger. It represents a man who is learning to slow down, to care for himself, and to bring that calm energy into the relationship instead of leaving it outside the door. And when she begins to feel that shift, even without being able to explain it, she responds differently. She becomes more comfortable in silence with you. She lingers a little longer in conversation. She relaxes more easily in your presence. Not because you are doing something dramatic, but because your energy has become safer, steadier, and more emotionally grounded. We are only at the beginning of understanding how these subtle routines shape attraction and intimacy on a deeper level. And in the next part, we will go further into how this nightly practice influences emotional connection, desire, and the unspoken signals that build stronger closeness over time. As that shift settles in, something more subtle begins to happen. Something most men never consciously notice, but almost every partner feels on an intuitive level. When a man becomes consistent with a calming nighttime ritual, even something as simple as an oil routine, it does not just change his skin or his appearance, it begins to change the emotional temperature he brings into the relationship. He is no longer carrying the residue of the entire day into the space between him and her. He is no longer tense in ways he cannot explain. He is no longer mentally scattered while physically present. Instead, he starts arriving in the relationship with a kind of softness that does not weaken him, but refines him. This is where emotional attraction starts to deepen, in ways that are not obvious at first. Because emotional attraction is not always sparked by intensity or excitement. In long-term intimacy, it is often sparked by familiarity that feels safe enough to relax into, yet still alive enough to feel meaningful. When she senses that you are taking care of yourself at night, that you have your own rhythm of slowing down, that you are not dependent on her presence to feel grounded, something inside her begins to shift. She does not feel responsible for stabilizing your emotional world. She does not feel like she has to manage your energy. Instead, she begins to experience you as someone who already knows how to regulate himself. And that is deeply attractive in a quiet, lasting way. Because in relationships where emotional closeness begins to grow, what often creates distance is not lack of love, but emotional overload. One person starts unconsciously carrying too much of the emotional weight for both. Conversations become heavy. Expectations become unspoken pressure. Even affection starts to feel slightly tense. But when a man develops a simple nighttime ritual that brings him back to himself, it prevents that buildup from happening in the first place. It clears emotional residue before it accumulates. And that keeps the relationship lighter, more breathable, and far more naturally connected. There is also a psychological transformation that happens through repetition. When you repeat a calming routine every night, your mind starts to associate that process with closure. The day is complete. There is nothing left to chase, nothing left to fix. That internal message is powerful because it reduces the constant mental background noise that many men carry without realizing it. And when that noise reduces, emotional presence increases. You become more available, not just physically, but mentally and emotionally. She notices this, even if she cannot name it directly. She notices it in the way you listen without rushing to respond. She notices it in the way you are not mentally halfway somewhere else while sitting next to her. She notices it in the way silence between you no longer feels uncomfortable or filled with tension, but instead feels neutral or even comforting. That kind of presence does not come from trying harder. It comes from being internally settled. And this is where something important about intimacy begins to reveal itself. Physical closeness in relationships is often supported or weakened by emotional grounding. When emotional grounding is unstable, physical connection can feel disconnected or inconsistent, even when attraction is still there. But when emotional grounding is steady, even small gestures of closeness feel more meaningful. A simple touch, a moment of proximity, a shared quiet evening, all of these become more emotionally rich because they are no longer competing with internal chaos. A nighttime oil routine, in its simplest form, becomes a symbol of that internal grounding. It is repetitive, tactile, slow, and deliberate. It forces a pause. It forces awareness of your own body. It brings you out of your head and into physical sensation. And that shift alone is powerful, because most modern stress exists in the mind, not the body. When you reconnect with your physical self at the end of the day, even in a small way, you reduce that mental fragmentation that often leaks into relationships. Over time, this creates a different kind of confidence. Not the loud kind that seeks validation, but the quiet kind that does not need constant reassurance. And in intimacy, that difference is felt immediately. Because someone who is grounded does not seek to pull the other person closer out of insecurity. They allow closeness to happen naturally. They are not trying to fill space. They are comfortable in it. She begins to experience this difference in subtle ways. She feels less pressure to constantly interpret your mood. She feels less confusion about where she stands emotionally. She feels more certainty in your presence, even without constant verbal reassurance. And certainty in emotional space is one of the strongest foundations for deeper intimacy. Because when the emotional environment feels stable, the mind relaxes. And when the mind relaxes, emotional openness increases. This is also where desire becomes more naturally aligned with emotional connection. Not as something forced or separated, but as something that flows from comfort and trust. When emotional safety increases, physical closeness becomes less about tension and more about expression. It is no longer driven by uncertainty or emotional imbalance. It becomes an extension of comfort, familiarity, and mutual presence. But perhaps the most overlooked effect of a nighttime ritual like this is how it changes your relationship with yourself. Because intimacy with someone else always reflects intimacy with yourself in some way. If you are constantly disconnected from your own needs, your own body, your own sense of presence, it eventually shows up in how you relate to another person. You either overreach for connection or withdraw from it. But when you build even a simple habit of caring for yourself at night, you start reinforcing a different message internally, that you are worth slowing down for, that your well-being matters even when no one is watching, that you are allowed to end the day in a state of calm instead of collapse. That internal message changes your emotional baseline. And when your emotional baseline changes, everything else in your relationship begins to adjust around it. She does not just respond to what you do. She responds to who you are when you are not performing anything at all. And a man who has learned to settle himself at night carries a different kind of presence into intimacy. He is not chasing emotional resolution through her. He is not using her to complete his sense of calm. He is already bringing calm with him. This is where connection deepens without effort, because the relationship is no longer being used to regulate emotional instability. It becomes a shared space rather than an emotional dependency. And shared space is where genuine intimacy grows strongest. There is room for attraction, room for comfort, room for silence, and room for closeness without pressure. The interesting thing is that none of this requires dramatic change. It does not require transformation of personality or identity. It begins with something small, almost insignificant on the surface, but consistent enough to shift your internal rhythm. A few minutes at night, a pause, a routine, a return to yourself. And over time, that small act begins to echo through the way you show up in every moment of connection. And as that presence becomes more stable, she starts to feel something she may not even articulate. That being with you feels easier, not less meaningful, not less intense in the right moments, but easier in a way that feels emotionally safe. And that sense of ease is often what allows deeper layers of intimacy to open naturally, without forcing anything, without confusion, without emotional strain. In the next part, we will go deeper into how this quiet consistency begins to shape long-term attraction, emotional bonding, and the unspoken dynamics that make intimacy not just stronger, but more deeply sustainable over time. As this pattern continues over time, something very important begins to emerge in the relationship dynamic, something that most people only recognize in hindsight. What started as a small nighttime ritual slowly becomes part of a larger emotional architecture between you and her. It is no longer just about what happens at night or how you wind down your day. It becomes about the kind of man you consistently are in her emotional world. Steady, grounded, and increasingly predictable in a way that feels safe rather than boring. And this distinction matters more than most people realize, because in intimacy, unpredictability can create excitement, but consistency creates depth. Excitement pulls attention, but consistency holds trust. And without trust, attraction remains surface level. With trust, attraction becomes layered, emotional, and far more enduring. When she begins to notice that your energy does not swing wildly with stress, that you are not emotionally reactive in the same way you once were, that you are more composed even in silence, she starts to feel a different kind of connection forming. Not a connection built on constant stimulation, but a connection built on emotional reliability. She begins to relax into the relationship instead of questioning it internally. And when a woman relaxes emotionally in a relationship, her capacity for intimacy deepens naturally, without force or pressure. This is where the deeper effects of your nighttime routine reveal themselves most clearly. Because what you do consistently with your own body and mind begins to shape how you are experienced by someone else. The oil on your skin, the slow ritual of care, the intentional pause before sleep, all of it signals something beneath the surface. It signals that you are not neglecting yourself. It signals that you are not living in constant internal tension. It signals that you know how to transition from doing into being. And this ability to shift from doing into being is one of the most powerful emotional traits in long-term intimacy. Many relationships struggle because both partners remain stuck in constant doing mode. Thinking, solving, reacting, planning. But intimacy requires presence. It requires the ability to simply exist with another person without always trying to manage, fix, or control the emotional space. When you carry that calm into your connection, it changes how she experiences closeness with you. She begins to feel that she does not have to compete with your inner chaos, because there is less of it. She does not have to decode emotional fluctuations as much, because your baseline becomes more stable. And stability in a partner creates emotional safety, even if it is never verbally discussed. Over time, this safety becomes the foundation for deeper openness. Conversations become more honest. Silence becomes more comfortable. Physical closeness feels more natural, because it is no longer layered with hidden tension. Instead of intimacy feeling like something that needs to be carefully navigated, it begins to feel like something that can simply be lived in. But perhaps the most profound shift happens within you. Because when a man begins to consistently care for himself at the end of the day, even in a simple and quiet way, he starts reinforcing a new identity internally. He is no longer the version of himself that collapses into exhaustion without awareness. He is no longer someone who ignores his own state until it becomes overwhelming. Instead, he becomes someone who participates in his own regulation, someone who actively brings himself back to balance. And that changes how he carries himself everywhere else. In conversation, there is less urgency. In emotional moments, there is more patience. In intimacy, there is less pressure and more presence. And presence is what transforms connection from something transactional into something deeply felt. She begins to notice that you are not trying to extract emotional validation from her in the same way. You are not constantly seeking reassurance to feel okay. You are not unconsciously leaning on her to stabilize your emotional state. Instead, you are contributing to the emotional stability of the space between you. And that shift alone can completely change the way attraction evolves in long-term intimacy. Because when emotional dependency decreases, attraction becomes cleaner. It is no longer mixed with pressure or confusion. It becomes something that can exist freely, without constant negotiation. And in that freedom, desire often becomes more natural, more relaxed, and more connected to genuine emotional closeness. At the same time, your nighttime ritual continues to reinforce something deeper in your nervous system. It teaches your body that rest is safe, that slowing down is not a loss of control, but a return to balance, that you do not have to carry the entire weight of the day into the night. And when your body learns that lesson repeatedly, your emotional responses begin to shift in everyday life as well. You become less triggered by small stressors, less reactive in misunderstandings, more capable of listening without immediately responding from emotion. And all of this feeds back into how intimacy feels for both of you. Because emotional regulation is not just a personal benefit. It directly shapes relational experience. She feels that difference even in simple moments. The way you respond when things are not perfect. The way you remain present when there is silence. The way you do not escalate emotionally when something is uncertain. These are not dramatic changes, but they are deeply felt ones, because emotional safety is not built in grand gestures. It is built in repeated experiences of stability. And as this stability continues to grow, something subtle yet powerful happens in her perception of you. You begin to feel more like a place than a question. Not something she has to figure out constantly, but something she can rest into. And in long-term intimacy, that shift is what allows emotional closeness to deepen without resistance. There is also an important truth that emerges here. Attraction is not only about what is added, but also about what is removed. When emotional noise decreases, when internal tension reduces, when reactive patterns soften, what remains is clarity. And clarity is what allows real connection to be seen and felt without distortion. Your nighttime routine, in this sense, is not about the oil itself. It is about what it represents in your life. It represents self-respect in quiet form. It represents emotional regulation, practiced daily. It represents a decision to end the day with awareness instead of collapse. And that decision, repeated over time, becomes part of your identity in the relationship. By the time intimacy reaches its deeper stages, what she feels is not just attraction in isolated moments, but a consistent emotional experience of being with you. A sense that you are present, that you are grounded, that you are not internally fragmented in ways that create distance. And that sense is what allows both emotional and physical intimacy to feel more integrated, more natural, and more sustainable. Because in the end, the strongest form of intimacy is not built on intensity alone. It is built on emotional safety, mutual presence, and the quiet confidence that comes from two people who are not constantly trying to stabilize each other, but instead meet each other from a place of internal steadiness. And when that happens, what begins as a simple nighttime ritual quietly becomes part of something much larger. Not just a habit, but a foundation for how connection, attraction, and emotional closeness continue to grow over time in a way that feels both grounded and deeply alive. This brings the full picture together, showing how something so simple can influence something so profound, shaping not just how you care for yourself, but how intimacy itself is experienced in the relationship as a whole.